Hi, I'm Michael Weitzner, and I've been an architect in New York City for 35 years. Today I'm going to break down the architectural details of some of New York City's most popular apartment layouts. First up, the brownstone apartment. So a brownstone is just one house in a series of row houses along the street that's actually made out of brownstone, which is a type of sandstone. So where do you find brownstones? You find them all over New York. You find them all over Brooklyn, the Upper East Side, the Upper West Side, Harlem. They were the residence of choice of developers in the mid-19th century. Let's take a look at one at 29 West 88th Street. Quite often, these brownstones were built as developments. That means they built multiple ones at once. You can see every other one has these arched windows at the top floor, that they were all built together. Each entrance has the same sort of treatment around it, and every other bay has a bay window. All that indicates that they were all built together as one design. So this row of brownstones has 4 floors above grade, 1 on grade, and then there's usually a cellar below that. And typically the main entrance was on what we call the parlor floor, or 1 floor above the ground level. And there's a big stoop that leads up to it. Stoop is just a Dutch word for staircase. Servants usually entered down on the ground floor, and the family entered on what was called the parlor floor. And the parlor floor is elevated just to avoid all of the horse manure that filled the streets of mid-19th century New York. So between each individual unit is what's called a party wall, and it's much easier to see from an overhead view. So one of the main characteristics of a brownstone apartment, though, is that you can only get light from the front or the back. Because of these party walls, you can't get it from the sides, unless, of course, you're the end house on the block. And as you can see, each house is set back from the rear, and it creates this whole rear yard that's over here. And here's the street. So New York City is laid out on a grid. So essentially what you have is between the avenues, you have a 200-foot block and then a 60-foot street, and then another 200-foot block and another 60 street. And so they took that 200-foot block right here, that's 200 feet, and then they took a 60-foot street. And they took that 200-foot block and they divided it in half, and they made 100-foot deep lots. And they basically divided those lots into 25-foot slivers. So that's the basic building block of a New York City block. And each one of these is 25 feet. And 200 plus 60 is 260, and if you multiply that by 20, you pretty much get a mile, and that's why 20 New York City blocks is considered 1 mile. So you'll notice in these overhead shots that there's no alleyways behind these rows of houses, and that's the reason why you see all the trash piled up on the front side of the street, because there was no alleyway to put the trash in the back. So in 1811, when they laid this out, people didn't really have that much garbage. I mean, there was a privy in the backyard, and you used nearly everything. Any food that you didn't use went to the livestock, and people didn't have nearly as much as what we all have today. So it's a common sight in New York to see these mountains of garbage along the curbs every other day of the week. And it's because we don't have alleyways. Now let's look at railroad apartments and tenement buildings. So a railroad apartment is essentially just an apartment where one room leads into the next room, like in a railroad car. You go from one car to the next. As an overhead view, you have one room leading into another room. So if this was the flat like that, there'd be one room here, and another room here, another room here. So if I'm in this room, in order to get to any other room, I've got to pass through each room if I wanted to get to the back room. Where in a typical apartment, there would be a corridor on the side, and you would circulate into each room from that corridor, like that. Okay, let's take a look at one at 39 Henry Street. Okay, this is a building that was built in the late 1800s on Henry Street on the Lower East Side. My grandmother was born in this building in 1899, and the building is still there. At that time, the street would have been filled with push carts and horses and throngs of people. Now it's just cars parked. So tenement houses were built for the lower classes, mainly for immigrant groups. So imagine in these earliest apartments having a family living in each one of these rooms. It would be very crowded, and there'd be absolutely no privacy. At a grander level, that's called enfilade, and you could see that in famous museums where you go from one gallery to the next gallery without going out into a corridor. But here, at a much smaller scale, it's how the apartments were set up, and usually there were just like 3 rooms. There was a bedroom, a kitchen, and maybe there was another room between them. Quite often it was just 2 rooms. So originally when these were built, a lot of these rooms didn't have any light and air. So light and air means natural light and operable windows to let fresh air into the rooms. A lot of these apartments had rooms with no windows at all and were inhabited by multiple families. And so obviously they were breeding grounds for disease. But at the time, there were no laws about that. It wasn't until about 1901 that New York City passed a law that said you must include air in these rooms. And so they created what's called these air shafts. And if we look at an overhead shot, you could see right here that these air shafts were then included, and they're very narrow. So the air shafts added light and air to a lot of these apartments, but at the same time, they also created other problems because trash would pile up in them and stagnant water would be there, and it would create a whole other source for disease. But by inserting these air shafts, you created what's called a dumbbell plan because the shape that was left was sort of shaped like a dumbbell. So early on, an entire family of 6 or 8 people would live just in one room. And there was a famous book by Jacob Riis called How the Other Half Lives. So people's eyes were open to the sort of squalor that people were living in, and that was what prompted change. And when these apartments were built, there was no plumbing, so there were still outhouses in the backyard. And when that law was passed for the air shaft, they also insisted that you had to have a toilet in each building, and no more than 20 people could share that toilet, which is quite astounding today. A lot of these apartments, people wonder why were there bathtubs in the kitchen? And there were bathtubs in the kitchen because there was no other place to put them. The apartments were so small, they didn't have room for a proper bathroom. And so the kitchen, if it had any plumbing, already had a sink. And so it made sense that that's where the bathtub would go, next to the existing plumbing. Even today, a lot of those apartments still have that weird arrangement of plumbing. And you could see bathtubs still in some kitchens. People did all sorts of elaborate things with these bathtubs. They had these coverings so that it became more counter space, and then they would take that covering off and use it as a bathtub. So as time wore on, starting in the 1930s, conditions were so deplorable in these tenements that a new paradigm was invented, and the idea was to create these new housing projects that were built around courtyards that were filled with light and air. And the intention was to provide much healthier living for the working class people of New York City. So a lot of these tenements were just knocked down, and they built these housing projects. Today, housing projects have this terrible reputation, but that's because all the funding for them has been systematically cut off, and so they've been starved, and they have no money for basic repairs, and because of that, they deteriorate and fall apart, and people are left living in conditions that were almost as bad as the tenement apartments that they were made to replace. So railroad apartments still exist, but quite often today, the bathrooms have been added to them. But because you have to walk from one room to another, privacy is really compromised. Next, the Classic 6 layout. So where do you find the Classic 6? Typically, they're found on the Upper West Side or the Upper East Side of Manhattan. They're called Classic 6s because typically they were 6 rooms. Let's look at one building called the Dartmouth at 509 Cathedral Parkway in Manhattan. We're just going to talk about this apartment here on the left. This one's actually a Classic 7, which is another typical kind of apartment. And as you can see, there's a main living room or a parlor, a separate and distinct dining room, a kitchen. Here it's 3 bedrooms and then a maid's room. And that's what makes the 7. Or you subtract one of those bedrooms and it becomes a Classic 6. You should note, though, that the kitchens are actually much smaller in these apartments originally, and that's because really only the maid used the kitchen. Most families in this station had servants, and the maid had their own room, and they were live-in, and they cooked the meals for them. The other thing you should note is the maid had her own bathroom, and then there was one bathroom shared by the rest of the family. And the other thing you should note is that they typically had very little closet space. And that's because when most of these were built, which I would say is in the 1920s, some were built a little before, some were built a little after, but the 1920s were the heyday of this type of apartment. People just had a lot less. They didn't have huge wardrobes, and they didn't have a lot of possessions, and so subsequently they didn't need nearly as much storage space. So what was really nice about these apartments is quite often they had a really gracious foyer, and then there was a corridor that led to all the rooms. Unlike a railroad apartment where you'd go from room to room to room, here you'd step out into a beautifully detailed corridor and go from room to room in your own apartment. A lot of these buildings were built before current zoning laws, where today windows facing one another like this would have to be 30 feet apart. Here it appears it's less than 20, which makes the rooms down at the end of these courtyards somewhat dark, especially if you're on a lower floor. But again, today it would be much wider and they'd be much brighter. So what prompted these buildings actually, or what helped prompt these buildings, was the invention of the elevator. So all of a sudden it became worthwhile to build multi-unit apartment buildings on 10 or 12 stories high. And without the elevator, they couldn't have done that. Before that, the highest you could go was 6 stories with a walk up. And now, once the elevator was invented, you could go up as high as you need to be, but typically they built 10 to 15 stories. I mean, this was a new style of living that sort of the Dakota helped bring about, and elevators were part of that new style, and that technology was instrumental in creating this new style of living. So here's a view of the exterior of the Dartmouth, and you can see that